Reflection on 22, Part 1, Release. She exhales what was once clenched. Release becomes sovereignty, love held without demand. Silence changes shape, trauma named without overtaking, integrated into strength. Truth claimed as her own. She publishes a held breath, a clean, intentional exhale. The letter doesn't demand reply. It releases the pressure and relocates her power inside the body. It is wound honoring and sovereignty claiming in the same breath. This is not an explosion, not a demand, not even a plea. It is what its title names it to be: release. This moment, the moment she set it down in words, she stopped rehearsing all the possible ways of reaching out, all the risks and retaliations of message, and let the tension go. She allows herself to name the ache, the urge to reach out, the hundreds of unspoken drafts circling in her body, and then she names the choice to hold them, to let the breath move out through writing rather than through rupture. Quote, "The urge to reach out lives next to the choice not to," end quote. That single line becomes the letter's spine. Everything around it turns on the balance between longing and restraint, ache and composure. In earlier letters, she screamed, begged, collapsed, or confronted. Here, she does something quieter and more radical. She breathes out. The longing is real, the restraint is real, and in naming both, she relieves herself of the pressure, and in naming both, she relieves herself of the pressure to act on either extreme. The letter itself becomes the exhale, a soft surrender into truth without performance. Naming trauma without being defined by it. One of the striking qualities of this piece is how precisely she names her nervous system and trauma state without collapsing into them. Earlier letters have carried roar eruptions, but here she balances candor with steadiness. She doesn't only say she hurts, she maps her body's volatility, her fear of sliding back into PTSD if she reopens contact. Quote, "I'm afraid I could very easily get re-triggered and slide back to active trauma or some version of PTSD, which I really don't want to. So I'm honoring that and not following the urge to reach out as I don't fully trust myself yet." End quote. That admission is not weakness, it is clarity. She exposes the vulnerability of being easily destabilized, while at the same time showing the strength of not letting that vulnerability dictate her choices. This is trauma literacy turned into sovereignty, an ability to hold pain in one hand and power in the other. It is also the voice of someone who has learned to hold both vulnerability and boundary in the same breath. She doesn't deny love. In fact, she amplifies it, insisting, quote, "There is nothing you could ever do that would make me never talk to you again," end quote. But she roots that love in new soil, one that honors her own limits first. This is release over rescue. She's not trying to fix him, renegotiate, or re engage. She is letting go in a way that preserves love while removing responsibility for his choices. Her words form a trauma literate witness. She names the nervous system, the PTSD risk, and the unpredictability of her own triggers. The naming is itself a stabilization technique, intellectual and embodied at once. The love she speaks of endures, but it has transformed. It no longer keeps her waiting, it reshapes her. It is framed not as something she hopes will be returned, but as something that has permanently altered her inner landscape. And finally, she brings herself back to presence. Again and again, she resists the pull of fantasy and projection and anchors herself in the simplicity of survival. One breath, one heartbeat, one day at a time. Language, tone, and rhetorical devices. The voice of this letter is plain and conversational, but woven through it are crystalline lines that act like anchors. Short, decisive sentences punctuate the emotional swell, giving her voice the cadence of someone who has found solid ground even while speaking from grief. Repetition becomes ritual here. I love you appears not as a desperate plea, but as a medicine and a witness. With each return, the phrase shifts from longing to truth to archetype. It no longer begs, it declares. The letter thrives on contrast and paradox. Vulnerability and firmness stand side by side, soft phrasing followed by categorical statements such as, I will not, I am not ever going to be the same person as before. This coexistence produces both moral gravity and emotional complexity. Imagery is embodied and ordinary at once. She speaks of her nervous system, of breath, of heartache, anchoring the letter in somatic experience. Then she folds in small domestic images, texting, calling, the decision not to press send, grounding the vast spiritual ache in the tangible choices of daily life. Together, these devices create a letter that feels lived rather than constructed. It speaks the way breath moves, uneven at times, catching, and then landing with clarity. Gratitude and devastation intertwined. The letter carries both gratitude and devastation in equal measure. It is not only grief, it is also the recognition that grief has been a teacher. Betrayal shattered her, yes, but in the shattering, she uncovered a deeper recognition of herself. Quote, one thing is certain, I am not ever going to be the same person as before, in a very radical way, and for that I have to thank you. End quote. This is brutal gratitude, the kind that acknowledges transformation only because old self was broken beyond repair. It is bitter and reluctant, but it is also true. She knows she would never have faced the full weight of her fears and patterns without the rupture. What nearly destroyed her also unearthed what had been hidden, the roots of her own unworthiness, the layers of protection, the ways she had once abandoned herself. The gratitude does not erase the devastation, it sits alongside it. She does not excuse him, nor does she justify his choices that harmed her. Instead, she integrates what the pain revealed. The paradox of release is here, not forgiving and forgetting, not pretending it didn't matter, but allowing the devastation to stand as the very ground from which a new self grows. Nervous system anatomy. For her, this letter functions as an interoceptive recalibration. By naming the triggers and choosing restraint, she signals to her parasympathetic system that action has been taken in a safe way. The hold state loosens. What results is a nervous system decompression, steadier breath, less compulsive checking, a new spaciousness inside the silence. She no longer waits for him to tell her what is real. She has told herself. For him, the effect is subtler, more somatic than conscious. The letter doesn't chase or bait, it creates absence where there was once pressure. The absence is felt as a low grade restlessness, the internal itch of someone who suddenly doesn't have the old friction to push against. It is not yet awareness, but it is movement. The nervous system registering the absence of demand as an unfamiliar sensation. In place of external pressure, there is only the mirror of his own choices. Together, these shifts alter the geometry between them. Silence once meant constriction for her, now it carries her breath. Silence once meant protection for him, now it unsettles. When paralyzed, her body What paralyzed her body has softened, while what protected his has begun to fidget. The letter's powers lies here, not in dialogue, but in the way it reconfigures the body's response to what remains unspoken. Field presence. The letter landed as a widening, a softening in the field, and a decompression inside her. It holds steady in the space, not pressing forward, not demanding response, but existing as its own truth. The act of release changed the texture of silence, less frantic, less raw, more breathable. Silence used to feel like erasure. Here, silence begins to feel like air. The geometry has shifted. What once closed in around her now opens just slightly enough for breath to circulate. It is not reconciliation, not closure, but it is livable. The letter as a mirror of her growth. She has written through rage, collapse, desperation, and hope. Now she writes through release. The progression is unmistakable. She no longer waits for him to tell her what is true. She has written her truth for herself. Quote, I do now know that I'm not crazy, and your behavior was and is not okay. Whether you see it or not, whether you're willing to own it or not, doesn't really matter. End quote. That line lands like an anchor dropped. No spinning, no negotiation, no reaching for external validation. Here is what she knows, and it is enough. Compared to the earlier pieces that carried a begging energy, this letter feels like maturation. Those past letters were tangled with attempts to persuade or provoke, still hoping for a shift in him. This one stands differently, a boundary enacted as art, both witness and release. Compared to the scream letters, the raw detonation of 15 or 20, the difference is tonal and enduring. A scream fractures the moment. This release reconfigures the baseline. It is less a lightning strike than a tide change, quieter but permanent. As a progression marker, this letter reads as a threshold moment. She has moved from reactivity toward integrated witness. That pivot is not only visible on the page, it changes the rhythm of the entire series. The work ahead will still carry ache, but it will also carry the steadier register of someone who has learned to speak from the center of her own truth. Image and aesthetic resonance. The chosen image, the torn scrap reading I love you lady always, carries the entire vibration of this piece. It is intimate, imperfect, and undeniably real. It doesn't posture, it doesn't shout, it simply exists as evidence of what once was and what still vibrates in the background. The way the paper looks, fractured yet legible, mirrors the letter itself, a love that remains through split, through torn. It doesn't need embellishment. The rawness is the resonance. It is love made material, but also fractured, incomplete. It whispers more than it declares, exactly like the letter. The visual becomes part of the release ritual, proof that love was written, carried, remembered, and yet not demanded back. Torn her handwritten note image amplifies the intimacy and authenticity of the message. It reads as relic, tactile, imperfect, human. The visual anchor supports the letter's function, not spectacle, but evidence. Something that proves love existed and still exists without demanding validation. On him. For him, this letter is different from the others because it doesn't chase. It doesn't demand or accuse. It simply exists as its own steady pulse. That shift is felt in the field as a subtle disturbance, not dramatic, not conscious, but present. Where past letters may have carried energy that invited reaction, this one doesn't offer an opening for counter argument. It lands more like atmosphere than confrontation. That kind of energy is harder to push away. He's left not with words to resist, but with silence that feels altered. The absence of pursuit registers as an unfamiliar weight, a quiet mirror of love and boundary held together. Whether he names it or not, that sensation now lingers in the background. For him, this letter carries a weight precisely because it does not ask for anything. Silence has been his shield, the way he avoids having to reckon with the impact of what he's done. But this release does not fuel the shield. It removes the friction he has leaned on. The absence of accusation leaves him alone with his own actions. In that space, avoidance does not absolve, it festers. He can rationalize, he can retreat further, but the truth is still present. Quote, "It's not that you hurt me and Amel, it's how you chose to do it." End quote. By refusing to chase or collapse, she places the consequences of his behaviors back in his lap, not as punishment, but as reality. He may not handle it consciously. His defense may stay intact for now, but the mirror is there. The silence he created now vibrates differently, charged with her release. What this teaches about her work and the field grammar. She is learning to transmit to stay. She can send a powerful, energetic transmission, love, boundary, and remain anchored. That capacity changes how her field operates. She will draw different mirrors now, mirrors that reflect steadiness rather than instigation. Closing reflection. The shape of release. In earlier letters, silence was torment. Here, silence becomes something she can inhibit. In closing, this letter does not resolve the story. It does not end the longing or erase the ache. What it does is release her from the paralysis of holding it all inside. Quote, "So present it is, today it is, and today is another day of silence. That is what is needed because that is what is here. That is the present." End quote. This is the most radical part of the release. She does not fill the silence with fantasy or collapse beneath it. She names it, lives it, and lets it stand. The letter ends not with closure, but with peace, a soft exhale that makes space for whatever might come next or for nothing at all. She gave herself permission to be both tender and sovereign. In the act of releasing without erasing love, she taught the field a new grammar, that love need not be exchangeable to be true. This letter is a lodestone, quiet, heavy, and real, and it marks a separative grace, the possibility of living fully while loving across absence. This is where the power lies. She can live inside the silence without collapsing. She can let the letter be the exhale, the anchor, the boundary, the witness. Release is not closure, but it is freedom from compulsion, and that is no small victory.